The courthouse doors closed behind me with a sound like a verdict of their own. And before I'd even reached the bottom step, Dean was there blocking the path, his shadow falling over me, the way it used to fall over every room he entered. "Don't ever set foot in my house again," he said loud enough for the cameras to catch it, loud enough for the reporters to lean in with their phones already recording. He wanted the world to see a broken woman standing in the cold. What he didn't know was that I had been waiting 22 years for this exact moment, and I had never once felt more prepared in my life. I want to tell you how we got here, because nothing about this story is as simple as the headlines made it look. I met Dean Ramsey when I was 23 waiting tables at a diner 2 blocks from the community college, where I was finishing my accounting degree at night. He was loud in the way ambitious young men are loud, full of ideas that outran his bank account by miles. And he had this way of looking at you like you were the only person who mattered. I fell for that look. I fell for the plans he sketched on napkins, for the garage he rented with money he didn't have, for the version of the future he described so vividly I could almost touch it. What people don't understand, what they never bothered to ask, is that Ramsey Technologies wasn't built by Dean alone. I was the one who sat up until 3 lacked in the morning, building the first financial models. I was the one who walked into 4 different banks and got turned down 3 times before I finally convinced a loan officer named Walter Higgins to take a chance on us. I found our first investor at a Rotary Club breakfast, cornering him by the coffee urn, because I'd read every article he'd ever written about early-stage manufacturing. I wrote half of that original business plan sitting at our kitchen table, with a baby monitor next to my elbow, because our daughter was 6 months old and Dean was already traveling, already becoming the face people saw in magazines. I didn't mind not at first. Someone had to run the meetings and shake the hands, and Dean was good at that. I told myself we were a team, that it didn't matter whose name appeared on the press releases, as long as we both knew the truth. I believed that for a long time, longer than I should have. The company grew the way fires grow slowly and then all at once. Within a decade, Ramsey Technologies had gone from a garage with 2 folding tables to a campus with its own parking structure. Dean's photograph appeared on the cover of a business magazine with the headline, "The Self-Made Visionary." I remember reading that at our kitchen counter, the same counter where I'd built the spreadsheets that made his vision possible, and saying nothing. I told myself it was just marketing. I told myself the truth didn't need to be printed to be real. But something shifted in Dean after that cover story. I watched it happen in small increments, the way you watch a tide come in without noticing exactly when your feet get wet. He stopped asking my opinion in strategy meetings. He started introducing me at company events as my wife, instead of my co-founder. A distinction that sounds small until you've lived inside it for years. He began surrounding himself with people who agreed with him, replacing seasoned executives who remembered where the company came from with younger hires, who only knew the legend Dean had built around himself. I noticed. Of course I noticed. I am not the kind of woman who misses things. There was a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because it was trash day, and I was rolling the bins to the curb when I saw Dean's calendar open on the kitchen tablet. A meeting scheduled with a divorce attorney's office downtown. No explanation. No conversation. Just an appointment tucked between a board call and a dinner with investors, as if ending our marriage was one more line item to manage before lunch. I stood there in the driveway for a long time, the bin handle still in my hand, feeling something settle inside me that wasn't quite grief. It was clarity. I didn't confront him. I want to be honest about that, because there's no version of this story where I stormed into his office and demanded answers. That was never who I was, and it was never going to serve me. Instead, I went upstairs that night, opened the fireproof file box I kept in the back of our closet, and read through documents I hadn't looked at in over 2 decades. Papers from the earliest days of the company, papers with my signature on them, and Dean's, though he'd barely glanced at the pages before signing. Papers our first attorney, a careful man named Arthur Voss, had helped me draft when Dean was too busy chasing investors to worry about boring legal formalities, as he called them. I closed the box and sat on the edge of our bed for a long time that night, watching the man I'd built an empire with sleep soundly beside me. Already dreaming, I imagined of a future that didn't include me. He had no idea what those papers said. He'd never had any idea. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the woman standing in someone else's shadow. I felt like a woman who had simply been waiting for the right moment to step into the light. He filed 3 weeks later. The process that followed would try to convince the entire world that I was a woman about to lose everything. They had no idea what I already owned. Dean didn't waste any time. Within a week of that quiet appointment I'd stumbled across on his calendar papers, arrived at the house by courier, delivered to my hands like an invoice for a marriage that had run its course. He'd hired Whitfield and Cross, the most aggressive divorce firm in the city, the kind of firm that advertised on billboards along the interstate, with slogans about protecting what's yours. I remember standing in the foyer, reading the filing, feeling strangely calm, the way you feel calm in the eye of a storm you've been watching approach for days. The press got hold of it almost immediately. Someone on Dean's side must have leaked it, because by the following Monday, a business blog ran a piece titled "Tech Titan Dean Ramsey Files for Divorce," complete with a photo of me from a charity gala years earlier, smiling in a green dress, captioned simply as his wife, not co-founder, not architect of the company's early financial strategy, just his wife, as if that were the whole of what I'd built. The narrative wrote itself after that, the way narratives do when nobody bothers to check the facts. Homemaker marries ambitious entrepreneur. Entrepreneur builds empire. The wife enjoys the fruits of his labor for 2 decades, then gets left behind when the marriage grows stale. I read the comments on those articles, some nights alone, in the guest room I'd started sleeping in, and I let people believe whatever they needed to believe. There was no version of the truth I could type into a comment box that would undo 22 years of a story Dean had been telling alone, on magazine covers and stages and interviews, where I was never once mentioned by name. The board reacted the way boards react to convenient stories with relief. I heard through a longtime assistant, a woman named Carol, who'd worked reception since the garage days, and still slipped me a sympathetic look whenever we crossed paths, that several directors had privately celebrated the idea that the divorce would resolve cleanly, with Dean retaining full operational control, and the personal matter, as they called it, fading quietly into the background. Nobody asked what my role at the company had actually been. Nobody thought to ask because Dean had spent years making sure that question never occurred to anyone. Dean genuinely believed that I would take a settlement sign, whatever his lawyers put in front of me, and disappear into some quiet second act far from the company we'd built. He told a mutual friend at a dinner party. This got back to me the way everything eventually gets back to you, that he expected me to want to move on and not drag this out. He wasn't being cruel exactly. He simply couldn't imagine that I might want something other than to vanish gracefully. What Dean never understood, what he had never bothered to understand in over 2 decades of marriage, was corporate structure. He hated the paperwork side of the business. He always had. In the earliest days, when we were incorporating Ramsey Technologies out of that cramped garage with the leaking roof, I was the one who sat across from Arthur Voss for hours going through clause after clause, while Dean paced outside on his phone, closing deals, making promises, building the version of himself he wanted the world to see, the world. I remember Arthur looking up at me once during those sessions, pushing his glasses up his nose and saying, "Mrs. Ramsey, most people don't think this carefully about worst-case scenarios when they're this excited about a beginning." I told him I'd learned a long time ago that excitement doesn't protect you from anything. My mother had lost everything in a divorce when I was a teenager, blindsided by finances she never understood because she'd never been allowed to understand them. I promised myself sitting in her kitchen at 16 years old, watching her cry over bank statements, that it would never happen to me. Not like that. Not ever. So when we incorporated the company, I insisted on several provisions that seemed at the time almost absurdly cautious. Clauses about fiduciary conduct, clauses about executive misconduct and shareholder protections, a clause buried on page 14 of a document Dean signed without reading past the signature line that addressed what would happen to certain ownership structures in the event of a marital dissolution. Arthur drafted it all with a care I don't think Dean ever appreciated, because Dean never once asked to see it again after that first signing. Not in 22 years. I never mentioned those documents to anyone after that. Not to Dean, not to friends, not even to my own attorney until the divorce proceedings began, and I finally pulled the folder from the fireproof box in my closet and drove it to her office myself. Her name was Renata Cole, a sharp, soft-spoken woman I'd hired quietly away from any firm connected to Dean's circle, someone who didn't feel the need to report back to anyone at the company. I watched her face change as she read through the original incorporation papers, watched her set down her coffee cup, slowly watched her look up at me with an expression somewhere between astonishment and respect. "Felicia," she said carefully. "Do you understand what you're sitting on?" I told her I did. I'd understood it for over 2 decades. I simply hadn't needed it until now. She asked me why I'd never used any of this leverage before. Why I'd let Dean take so much credit, let the board sideline me, let the press paint me as nothing more than the woman standing beside him in old photographs. I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered. The truth was, I never wanted to win by force. I had wanted for a very long time for Dean to simply remember what we'd built together, to say my name in a boardroom, the way he used to say it in that garage back when neither of us had anything, and both of us had everything. He never did remember. And so, sitting in Renata's office that afternoon, I finally let go of waiting for him too. The ruling came down on a Thursday, and by Friday night, Dean was already celebrating. He rented out the top floor of the Meridian Club downtown, the same venue where we'd once hosted our 10th anniversary party, string lights and all, and filled it instead with executives, board members, and a jazz trio he'd flown in from Chicago. I heard about it from Carol, who called me that evening, sounding almost apologetic, like she felt obligated to warn me before I saw it splashed across social media. Dean had introduced his girlfriend that night. Her name was Bianca, 29 years old, a marketing consultant Ramsey Technology Tonners had hired the previous spring. He walked her through that room on his arm, like a trophy he'd finally been allowed to claim. And the board members, the same men and women who'd sat across from me at strategy meetings for 15 years, raised their glasses to him without a flicker of hesitation. I wasn't angry when I heard about it. I want to be honest about that because anger would have been easy, and easy wasn't what I needed right then. What I felt instead was something quieter and clear's throat, far more useful confirmation. Dean believed the story was over. He believed he had cleanly walked away with the company, the house, the name on the door, and a younger woman on his arm, as proof that his best years were still ahead of him. That confidence, that particular flavor of certainty that comes from a man who has never once been told no, was exactly what I needed him to feel. While Dean toasted his own reflection, I was 3 miles away in a conference room with 2 forensic accountants named Priya Malhotra and Sam Ostrowski, people Renata had recommended after quietly vetting a dozen firms with no ties whatsoever to Ramsey Technologies. We met after hours in a rented office space above a dry cleaner because I didn't want a single soul inside that company to know what we were building until it was finished. What we found didn't surprise me so much as it saddened me in the particular way that watching someone destroy themselves slowly always saddens you, even when you know they deserve the consequences coming for them. Over the past 4 years, Dean had approved a string of executive expenses that never should have cleared internal review. A private jet lease routed through a shell entity home renovations on a lake house build as a corporate retreat consulting fees paid to a company that turned out to be owned by Bianca's brother. None of it was hidden particularly well. Dean had never needed to hide anything because for years, nobody with real oversight had bothered to look. Priya found something else, something that made even her pause during one of our late-night reviews. A pattern of shareholder disclosure violation, stretching back nearly 3 years. material information about a failed product line that Dean had kept from the board, entirely protecting his own bonus structure at the expense of investors who trusted him. Sam found compensation approvals. Dean had pushed through for two executives who records showed had personal relationships with him that were never disclosed as conflicts of interest. I never touched a single company system that wasn't already available to me through legitimate channels. I want that understood clearly, because I know how these stories can sound when you're on the outside, looking in like some elaborate act of sabotage. Some vengeful woman digging through her husband's secrets out of spite. It wasn't like that. Every document we assembled came from corporate records I was legally entitled to review as a founding shareholder. Records that had simply been buried under years of Dean's assumption that no one would ever bother to look. Renata was meticulous about this. We do this by the book, she told me more than once, because the moment we don't, we hand him the only weapon he has left. It took 6 weeks to build the file properly. 6 weeks of quiet meetings, of driving to that rented office after dark, of sitting across from Priya and Sam, while they walked me through spreadsheets that told a story Dean had never imagined anyone would read. There were nights I sat in my car afterward, in the empty parking lot beneath a single, flickering street lamp, and let myself feel the full weight of what I was looking at. Not triumph, not yet, but something closer to grief. This was still the man I had loved, once the man who used to fall asleep on our garage floor, surrounded by blueprints, too excited about the future to make it upstairs to bed. Some part of me had hoped for a long time that this evidence would never need to see daylight. But hope isn't a strategy. And Dean had made his choice the moment he blocked me out of the very company I'd helped build. The moment he decided the truth could simply be edited out of the story, as long as he controlled the microphone. Once the file was complete, Renata reached out through proper channels to 2 independent board members. She trusted women who had grown increasingly uneasy about Dean's judgment the past year, but lacked the documentation to act on their instincts. Within days, an emergency confidential session was scheduled, closed to the public, closed to the press, closed, most of all, to Dean himself. He had no idea it was happening. He was still riding high off his engagement announcement to Bianca, still convinced the hardest chapter of his life was safely behind him. He had absolutely no idea what was coming for him in that boardroom, or how quickly the empire he thought was, finally, permanently his, would begin slipping through his fingers. Let me take you back to where I started this story. The courthouse steps, the cold morning air, Dean's shadow falling over me like it had 100 times before. "Don't ever set foot in my house again," he said, and I watched the cameras drink it in, watched the reporters angle their phones for the perfect shot of the broken wife on the losing end of a very public divorce. Dean's attorney stood just behind his shoulder, practically pining. Bianca waited by the car, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, already scrolling through her phone, as if this were simply another item on Dean's morning schedule. I let him have his moment. I have always believed that people reveal the truest parts of themselves in moments they think they've already won. And Dean, standing there on those steps with his chin lifted, and his voice pitched for an audience, was showing the world exactly who he'd become. Not the boy who used to fall asleep over blueprints in a garage that smelled like motor oil and instant coffee. A man who needed an audience to feel like a victory counted. "Actually," I said, and I let the words sit there for a moment before I continued, because I wanted him to hear the calm in my voice before he understood what it meant. "This house is mine now." He laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly, more the reflexive laugh of a man who assumes he's misheard something absurd. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder Renata had prepared. A plain manila folder that looked almost comically unremarkable for what it contained, and I held it out to him. "What is this?" he said. Not really a question, more an irritated dismissal, the tone he used to use with junior employees who interrupted his lunch. "Read it," I said. "You should have read it 22 years ago too. But I understand you were busy." He opened it there on the courthouse steps, in front of the reporters, in front of Bianca, in front of his own attorney, because his pride wouldn't let him wait until he was somewhere private to find out what a woman he'd already dismissed could possibly have to show him. I watched his eyes move across the first page, a transfer of title on our marital residence, dated and notarized weeks earlier, executed under a provision from our original property agreement that predated the divorce filing entirely. I watched his jaw tighten as he flipped to the second page, a board resolution. His hands, I noticed, had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man whose body understands something his mind hasn't caught up to yet. The third page was the emergency executive vote dated 2 days prior, signed by 7 of 9 board members. With the 2 dissenting votes belonging to executives Dean had personally installed the previous year. The fourth page confirmed ownership restructuring, based on preferred share protections activated by findings of executive misconduct findings that had been formally presented, reviewed, and accepted by outside counsel in that closed session I'd arranged weeks earlier. The fifth page, the one his attorney finally lunged forward to grab out of his hands as though snatching it away, could somehow undo what Dean had already read, was a formal notice of his removal as Chief Executive Officer of Ramsey Technologies, effective immediately pending further investigation into the financial irregularities outlined in the attached Appendix E. "This isn't possible," Dean said. His voice had lost the pitch he'd used for the cameras. It had gone thin, almost boyish, and for just a moment I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not yet, but genuine bewilderment. The look of a man watching the ground shift, beneath feet that had never once doubted their footing. His attorney was already flipping through the pages, his composure cracking as he scanned the language, muttering something about verifying authenticity, about emergency injunctions, about calling the office immediately. I watched him work through the stages of realization that Renata had warned me he would go through: disbelief, then scrutiny, then the slow, sinking understanding that everything in that folder had been executed with such precision that there was nothing left to challenge. A reporter near the bottom of the steps had noticed the shift, too. I saw her lower her phone slightly, her expression sharpening, sensing that the story she'd come to cover had just changed shape entirely. Whispers moved through the small crowd the way whispers do, quick and quiet, spreading faster than any of us standing there could control. Dean looked up at me, the folder trembling slightly in his grip. Bianca, now standing frozen by the car with her sunglasses pushed up into her hair, watching us both with an expression I couldn't quite read. Confusion maybe, or the early edges of calculation. A woman reconsidering the terms of the future she'd signed up for. "This isn't possible," Dean said again, quieter this time, more to himself than to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. 22 years of being underestimated had taught me that the quietest sentence in the room is often the one people remember longest. "You should have read what you signed," I said. I watched something in him fold, not dramatically, not with the kind of collapse you'd see in a film, but the smaller, more human kind, his shoulders dropping half an inch, his eyes losing their focus for just a moment, as the version of his life he'd been so certain of began quietly rearranging itself into something unrecognizable. His attorney was already pulling him toward the car, already talking about damage control, about emergency motions, about calling people who I already knew would not be answering their phones for him that afternoon. I stood on those courthouse steps a little longer than I needed to. Not out of cruelty, but because for the first time in months, I wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. The cameras kept clicking. Let them. For 22 years, the story of Ramsey Technologies had been told a certain way with Dean at the center of every frame. It was time the frame widened. To understand how quickly everything shifted after that morning on the courthouse steps. You have to go back further than the divorce, further even than the marriage itself, to a version of Felicia Ramsey that almost no one still working at the company had ever met. Before Ramsey Technologies existed, as anything more than a name Dean had scrolled on a legal pad, my family had a small trust established by my grandfather, a machinist who'd spent 40 years building precision parts for the auto industry and never trusted a bank further than he could see one. That trust wasn't large by the standards Dean would later measure success in, but it was mine untouched. Adi, and it was the money I used to purchase our very first batch of preferred shares when Ramsey Technologies Incorporated, back when the company was worth less than the folding tables we conducted meetings on. Arthur Voss had structured those shares carefully at my request, with voting protections attached to specific triggering conditions, findings of executive misconduct, material breaches of fiduciary duty fraud. At the time, it read like an absurd worst-case scenario clause, the kind of provision a cautious young wife includes, because she watched her mother lose everything and never wants to feel that powerless again. Dean signed off on it without a second glance, the same way he signed off on most of the paperwork in those early years, because paperwork bored him and momentum was the only thing that ever held his attention. Neither of us could have predicted back then, sitting on the floor of that garage, surrounded by blueprints and cold pizza, that those boring protections would one day determine who controlled a billion-dollar company. Dean never understood corporate governance the way I did, and I don't say that unkindly. It simply wasn't where his interests lived. He understood vision, charisma, the art of convincing a room full of skeptical investors that his instincts were worth betting on. He built relationships and closed deals and stood on stages accepting awards for innovation. But the architecture underneath all of that, the legal scaffolding that determined who actually held power when things went wrong, was something he delegated entirely to me, and then over the years forgot I had ever built at all. When the independent board members reviewed the forensic findings, Priya and Sam had assembled the language of those original protective provisions, activated almost mechanically. There was no dramatic vote required, no room full of executives debating Dean's fate late into the night. The moment outside counsel formally confirmed evidence of fiduciary misconduct, the misused funds, the undisclosed conflicts of interest, the shareholder violations, the preferred share protections tied to my family trust, shifted voting control automatically exactly as Arthur had drafted them, to do more than 2 decades earlier. The board's hands were, in the truest sense, tied. They weren't choosing to remove Dean out of personal loyalty to me. They were following a legal structure that had been quietly waiting in the company's foundation the entire time, like a support beam nobody remembers installing until the day it's finally needed. Renata explained it to me afterward, in terms I found almost beautiful in their simplicity. "You didn't take the company from him, Felicia," she said. "The company simply returned to the terms you both agreed to at the very beginning. He just never read the agreement closely enough to remember what those terms were." The house followed a similar path, though that piece was simpler. A straightforward property agreement finalized during the divorce proceedings that designated the marital residence as mine, based on the original funding structure and my documented financial contributions to its purchase contributions. Dean's attorneys hadn't bothered to investigate closely because they'd assumed, as everyone always assumed, that Dean had paid for everything himself. He hadn't. Not that house, not the company, not even if I'm honest. The life he'd spent the last decade believing was entirely his own creation. None of what happened to Dean in those weeks was illegal or vindictive, or even in the strictest sense surprising. Every document, every clause, every provision had existed for over 20 years, sitting quietly in filing cabinets and legal archives, waiting for someone to finally read them the way I had read them back, when I was young enough to still believe. Caution was a form of pessimism rather than what it actually was, a form of self-respect. Dean simply never understood how vulnerable his position had always been, because he never imagined I was someone capable of building a safety net that strong, that quiet, that patient. He had spent so many years constructing a version of our story where he stood at the center, and I stood somewhere just outside the frame, that he never once considered the possibility that I had been building something of my own the entire time. Not out of malice, not even out of anticipation of this exact outcome, but simply because I had learned a long time ago that the people who love you can still, without meaning, to leave you standing in a driveway with nothing. I had promised myself, I would never stand in that driveway again. Standing now in the study of the house that was legally, finally, undeniably mine, surrounded by boxes of files that told the true story of everything we'd built together. I didn't feel triumphant so much as I felt something quieter, something closer to relief. The empire hadn't changed hands through betrayal or scheming. It had simply, after 22 years, returned to the hands of the person who had protected it all along. Dean did not go quietly. I want to be honest about that, because there's a version of this story where he simply accepts the ruling signs, the paperwork, and disappears into some graceful second act. That was never who Dean was, and grief, I've learned, rarely brings out a person's most graceful instinct. He sued first, of course. Within days of the emergency board session, his attorneys filed motions challenging the validity of the original incorporation documents, arguing the provisions were outdated, improperly executed, or simply too obscure to hold up under modern corporate law. Renata had anticipated this. Every filing Dean's team submitted, we'd already prepared a response for, because Arthur Voss, meticulous even in retirement, had kept immaculate records of every signature, every witness, every notarization from the very beginning. The judge dismissed Dean's first motion within 2 weeks. His attorneys filed an appeal. That too went nowhere, because there was nothing ambiguous about documents Dean himself had signed, however carelessly, more than 2 decades earlier. He called in favors next. I heard about this the way I heard about most things during that period through Carol, who still worked reception, and still out of some loyalty I never fully understood, but was deeply grateful for, kept me informed of the mood inside the building. Dean called former board members he'd once golfed with, investors he'd wined and dined at conferences, executives he'd personally promoted over the years. Most of them, Carol told me, didn't return his calls. The ones who did offered polite, non-committal sympathy and nothing more. Investors, it turns out, care far more about stability than loyalty, and nothing about Dean's unraveling suggested stability. The forensic findings had already begun circulating in whispered form through the industry, and no one wanted to be seen standing too close to a man under active investigation for fiduciary misconduct. The employees surprised me the most, though perhaps they shouldn't have. In the weeks after I stepped in as interim CEO, I made a point of walking the floors myself. Something Dean had stopped doing years earlier, back when he decided his time was better spent in boardrooms and green rooms than among the people actually building the products that made the company worth anything. I remembered names. I remembered the engineer, a soft-spoken man named Julian Reyes, who'd once told me in the early days that he'd taken a pay cut to join us because he believed in what we were building. I remembered the operations manager, Deborah Kim, who'd worked through 2 pregnancies without ever once being offered adequate leave, because Dean had quietly stripped down the benefits program years earlier to improve quarterly numbers before a shareholder meeting. Several executives, once I was back in a position to actually listen, admitted things to me they would never have said to Dean directly. One senior director, a careful, guarded man named Terrence Whitlock, who'd been with the company almost as long as I had told me during a private meeting, that he'd flagged compliance concerns about certain expense approvals nearly 3 years earlier and been quietly told to let it go. I should have pushed harder, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. I told him most people in his position wouldn't have pushed at all. He didn't seem comforted by that, and honestly, I wasn't trying to comfort him. I was trying to understand exactly how long this pattern had been allowed to grow unchecked, and how many people had watched it happen in silence, the same way I once had. Becoming interim CEO wasn't a decision I made lightly, and it wasn't one I made out of any desire for the title itself. I had spent 22 years building the foundation of that company from behind the scenes, and stepping into the light after so long felt less like a victory lap, and more like finally finishing a job I'd started decades earlier and never gotten to complete. I didn't walk into that office thinking about revenge. I walked in thinking about Julian, about Deborah, about the hundreds of employees who'd shown up every day and done good work for a company that had, under Dean's leadership, slowly stopped deserving their loyalty. The first thing I did was restore the benefits program Dean had gutted fully retroactively where possible, funded by cutting the excessive executive perks that had quietly drained the company for years. Knew the private jet leases, the inflated consulting contracts, the compensation packages tied to relationships rather than performance. I ended 3 vendor contracts that existed solely because of personal connections to Dean or his inner circle. I rehired 2 experienced managers Dean had pushed out the previous year for being, in his words, too cautious managers whose caution, it turned out, had been trying to warn him about exactly the problems that eventually brought him down. The stock, which had dipped sharply during the scandal's early coverage, began climbing again within 2 months, slowly at first. Then, with the kind of steady confidence that comes when investors sense a company is being run by someone who actually understands what's underneath the surface, financial analysts started writing pieces reassessing the company's history. And one publication, the same one that had once run a cover story calling Dean the self-made visionary, published a lengthy feature titled The Woman Behind Ramsey Technologies. What the story left out. I read that piece late one night alone in my study, and felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight for over 2 decades. Dean, meanwhile, watched all of this from a distance he'd never occupied before, cut off from the boardrooms, the events, the version of himself he'd spent 20 years building in public. He was no longer the face of the company. He was increasingly a name attached to an ongoing investigation, a man whose former allies had quietly one by one stopped answering his calls. I never celebrated any of it. I want that understood clearly. There was no champagne toast in my office the night the stock fully recovered. No private moment of gloating over what had been taken from Dean. What I felt, instead, walking through those familiar hallways as employees nodded to me, with something that looked increasingly like genuine respect, was simpler than triumph. It felt for the first time in a very long while, like coming home to something that had always quietly belonged to me. Several months passed before I walked through the house again, the way I used to walk through it in the earliest years. Unhurried, present, actually seeing the rooms instead of moving through them, on my way to somewhere more important. I didn't redecorate right away. Friends found that strange, I think, expecting me to rip out every trace of the life Dean and I had built together to erase him from the walls the way he'd tried to erase me, from the company he claimed as entirely his own. But I've never believed revenge looks like destruction. I kept the photographs from our daughter's childhood on the hallway shelf. Kept the reading chair by the window where I used to nurse her at 2:00 in the morning, while Dean slept soundly down the hall, exhausted from chasing investors during the day. Some of those memories were still mine to keep regardless of what Dean and I had become to each other. I wasn't interested in burning down a past, just because the man in most of those photographs had disappointed me. Dean by then was no longer CEO of anything. The investigation into his executive decisions had expanded beyond the initial findings, pulling in questions about tax filings, about additional undisclosed relationships with vendors, about a pattern of behavior that painted a far less flattering portrait than the one that had once graced magazine covers. I didn't follow it closely. I'd hired good people to run the legal side of things, and I'd learned, over those difficult months, that there's a particular kind of peace that comes from no longer needing to track every movement of someone who once controlled so much of your attention. I saw him once unexpectedly on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at a small grocery store near the edge of town, the kind of place neither of us would have set foot in during our years of catered dinners and private chefs. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in some quieter way, the confidence that used to fill every room he entered now noticeably absent. Bianca was not with him. I never asked, and Carol never volunteered exactly what had happened there, though. I suspect a man under federal investigation with dwindling assets holds considerably less appeal than a rising tech visionary once did. We stood there for a moment in the produce aisle, an absurdly ordinary setting for a conversation that had been 2 decades in the making. He looked at me for a long time before he finally spoke. "Was all of this your plan?" he asked. His voice didn't carry the sharpness it once had. It sounded more than anything genuinely curious, like a man finally willing to ask a question he'd spent months avoiding. I thought about how to answer that honestly, because I owed him honesty. Even now, even after everything, the truth was more complicated than the story people wanted to believe. More complicated even than the story I sometimes told myself on the hardest nights. No, I said, and I meant it completely. My plan was for us to build something together. I let that sit between us for a moment, watching something shift behind his eyes. Some recognition, maybe, of the years we'd actually spent as partners before ambition, and applause slowly convinced him he'd done it alone. I didn't feel the need to say anything else. There was no triumphant final line I wanted to deliver, no last blow to land. I simply turned, picked up the bag of oranges I'd come in for, and walked toward the register, leaving him standing there among the vegetables, with a question I suspect he'll be sitting with for a very long time. I think about that moment often, more than I expected to. Not because I miss him. I don't, not really, not in any way that keeps me up at night, but because it reminded me how strange it is, watching someone you once built an entire life with, become someone you barely recognize. Dean wasn't always the man who blocked me on those courthouse steps. He was once the boy who fell asleep on a garage floor, surrounded by blueprints, too excited about our future to make it upstairs to bed. I try to hold both versions of him in my memory, honestly, because I think pretending he was always the villain of this story would be its own kind of dishonesty. Ramsey Technologies is stronger now than it's been in years. The employees who stayed through the hardest months tell me the culture feels different, steadier, more honest. Julian Reyes was promoted to lead engineering last spring. Deborah Kim now sits on the executive team, helping oversee the very benefits program Dean once quietly dismantled. I don't run every meeting, don't need to control every decision, because I finally trust the people around me to build something lasting. The same way I once trusted a young man in a garage, who for a while at least deserved that trust. Sometimes revenge isn't destroying someone's life. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let them rewrite the truth about who built it in the first place. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that quiet strength outlasts arrogance every single time. Patience isn't weakness. Preparation isn't paranoia. And the greatest victory available to any of us isn't watching someone else fall. It's reclaiming your own dignity and choosing, even after everything, not to let bitterness be the thing that defines what comes next. I want to know what you would have done in my position. Would you have shown him that folder the way I did, or would you have handled it differently? Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one, and waiting to be told. So, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this again. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. Kyle stood in the doorway of our bedroom, arms crossed, watching me struggle to sit up against the pillows. I still had the surgical brace strapped around my lower back. I still had the faint bruise from the IV line on my left hand, and he said it like he was reading me a weather report. This Saturday, all 12 members of my family are staying at our house for 2 weeks. Have everything ready. I actually laughed, thinking it was a joke. Then I looked at his face. He wasn't joking. That was the moment I understood. Something had shifted in our marriage and I hadn't been told. 5 days. That's how long it had been, since Dr. Whitfield closed the incision along my spine and told me in that flat, clinical voice doctors use when they want you to actually listen, that I needed a minimum of 4 weeks without lifting, without standing more than 15 minutes at a stretch, without climbing stairs more than once or twice a day. He'd handed me a printed sheet with the restrictions in bold. I still had it folded in my nightstand drawer, right next to the bottle of oxycodone I was trying to take as little of as possible. Kyle, I said, keeping my voice even because I'd learned a long time ago that raising it never got me anywhere with him. I just had surgery. Please, can we postpone it until next weekend? Even just a few days would help. He didn't look up from his phone. No one is waiting, just do as I say. That sentence landed somewhere I didn't expect. Not in my chest where I thought hurt was supposed to live. It landed lower in my stomach, in the place where you feel something curdle. 22 years of marriage, and he'd never spoken to me quite like that before. Not with that particular coldness. Like I was an employee who'd asked for a day off during a busy season, and he was simply informing me the request was denied. I didn't argue. I've never been a woman who argues well in the moment. I need time to turn things over to look at them from every angle before I know what I actually think. "Through so." I just nodded, and he left the room satisfied, already texting his mother the arrival details. I assumed, though I didn't ask. That night, I lay awake long after Kyle's breathing evened out beside me. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, the blades catching the blue light from the street lamp outside our window. My back ached in that deep structural way that reminded me my body was healing from something serious, something that had involved a surgeon cutting through muscle to reach bone. And for the first time, in longer than I could remember, I let myself actually think about the last 2 decades, instead of just living through them. Every summer without fail, Kyle's family descended on our house like a small cheerful army. His parents, George and Linda, who'd been married 50 years, and had opinions about everything from how I loaded the dishwasher to how I seasoned a roast. His brother, Ethan, who'd said more than once, usually after his 3rd beer, that this house had always felt like the family house, as if that were a compliment and not a small act of erasure. Ethan's wife and their 2 teenagers, Kyle's younger sister and her husband, their toddler, who was admittedly adorable, but who also meant I spent 2 weeks cutting grapes into quarters and wiping down high chairs. 12 people for 2 weeks every single summer since Kyle and I got married. I did the math once years ago out of curiosity more than anything, and stopped when the number of hours started to feel like an accusation. I bought the groceries a specific list, because Linda didn't eat gluten and George didn't eat anything spicy, and the teenagers apparently required a constant supply of a particular brand of string cheese. I made up the beds in the guest room and blew up the air mattresses for the overflow. I did the laundry, mountains of it, towels and sheets that smelled like other people's homes. I drove to the airport. I planned the meals. I smiled in photographs where I was always the one slightly outside the frame, the one who'd just run back into the kitchen to check on something. Not once in 22 years had anyone asked if I was tired. Not once had anyone asked if the timing worked for me. It had simply always worked, because I had simply always made it work, the way water finds the lowest point and settles there without complaint. I thought about our daughter Chloe away at college now, probably asleep in some dorm room, 3 states, over blissfully unaware that her mother was lying in the dark, doing arithmetic on her own exhaustion. I thought about the promise I'd made to myself in the hospital recovery room, groggy from anesthesia, when I told myself that this surgery was going to be the thing that finally slowed me down, finally made me protect myself, the way I'd spent 2 decades protecting everyone else. I reached for the bottle of pain medication on the nightstand, shook out 1 pill, then set it back down without taking it. I wanted my head clear. Instead, I reached past it for my laptop, the screen throwing pale light across the blanket, across the brace still cinched around my middle. I wasn't checking recipes. I wasn't building a grocery list or looking up which hotel might have a crib for the baby. For the first time in my marriage, I opened the folder containing the deed to our house. The deed was exactly where I remembered, it tucked into a manila folder in the fireproof box my father had bought decades ago. Back when he still worried about things like fires and floods and the ordinary disasters of life. I hadn't opened that box in years. There was no reason to. But that night, with Kyle asleep beside me and my back throbbing in slow, deliberate waves, I carried my laptop and a small flashlight into the hallway bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the closed toilet lid, reading paperwork, like it was a novel I couldn't put down. My parents bought this house in 1994. I grew up in it, in the room that later became my daughter's nursery, then her bedroom, then the guest room where Kyle's mother slept every summer without ever once thanking me for the fresh sheets. When my father passed 8 years ago, and my mother followed 2 years after him, the house came to me, not to me and Kyle. To me. I remembered signing papers at the lawyer's office, remembered Kyle sitting beside me that day, distracted checking his phone saying, "That's great, honey," without really looking up. He'd never asked to see the deed, he'd never needed to. In his mind, from the day we moved our furniture back into my childhood home, it simply became our house. And somewhere in that quiet grammatical shift, my ownership dissolved into something communal. Something he felt entitled to open up to 12 relatives without asking me first. I read every page twice. The language was plain, almost startling in its clarity. Sole owner. My name, and only my name, printed beneath my father's signature and the notary's seal. I sat there in the bathroom at 1 in the morning, my knees pulled up awkwardly, because bending my spine still hurt and felt something in me settle. Not anger, exactly. Something steadier than anger. Clarity, maybe. The next morning after Kyle left work, I called Diane Foster, the attorney who'd handled my parents' estate. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but she remembered me right away. Remembered the little jar of homemade jam I'd brought to her office out of gratitude after the estate closed. I told her everything. The surgery, the 12 relatives, Kyle's flat refusal to even consider postponing. She listened without interrupting the way good lawyers do, letting me talk myself all the way to the point. "Melissa," she said finally, "let me ask you's on the deed." "Mine," I said, "just mine." "Then legally, you have full authority over who occupies that property and under what conditions. Your husband doesn't need to co-sign a decision about your own home. You're not asking permission. You're informing him." I sat with that for a long moment, the phone warm against my ear. "I don't want to hurt him," I said, and I meant it. Whatever else was true, I hadn't stopped loving Kyle. I just didn't know anymore if he'd stopped seeing me. "This isn't about hurting anyone," Diane said, and her voice softened in a way that told me she'd had this conversation with other women before. Maybe many times. "You had major surgery 5 days ago. Your doctor gave you explicit restrictions. You are not obligated to host anyone, family or otherwise, while you're recovering. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty, Melissa. It's the bare minimum of taking care of yourself. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty." I wrote it down on a sticky note and pressed it to the edge of my laptop, where I'd see it every time I opened the screen. We talked for another 20 minutes about logistics, what I could legally do, what documentation I'd need, how to handle things cleanly and without leaving room for anyone to claim I'd acted out of spite. Diane was careful about that last part. "Paper trail," she kept saying. "Everything in writing, everything defensible." I appreciated that she never once asked me to reconsider, never once suggested I was overreacting. She treated my exhaustion as a fact, not a feeling to be managed. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking out at the backyard, where George always set up his folding chair in the one patch of shade, where Linda liked to inspect my flower beds and offer unsolicited advice about mulch. I thought about the 4 weeks of recovery ahead of me. The physical therapy, appointments already on the calendar, the simple fact that I could barely carry a laundry basket without wincing, let alone cook 3 meals a day for a dozen people. I wasn't plotting revenge. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell this story as though I sat there scheming, rubbing my hands together like some cartoon villain. That wasn't it at all. I was tired and scared of my own body's limits for maybe the first time in my adult life, and I was starting slowly to understand that the house I'd grown up in, the house my father had left me, didn't have to be a place where I disappeared into service every summer. I opened a fresh document on my laptop and began making a list. Not a grocery list, not a cleaning schedule, a plan. By Thursday, I had 3 phone calls scheduled, and I made every single one of them, from the quiet of my car parked in the pharmacy lot, 2 miles from the house. My seat reclined just enough to keep the pressure off my lower back. I didn't want Kyle walking past and overhearing, not because I was hiding anything illegal. Diane had been very clear that everything I was about to do was well within my rights, but because I needed to finish what I was building, before he had the chance to talk me out of it the way he always managed to, with that particular tone he used when he wanted something, and had decided my resistance was just a formality to be waited out. The first call was to a company called Buckeye Restoration, an interior renovation outfit that handled everything from water damage to full remodels. I told the woman on the phone, a brisk, efficient sort named Patricia, that I needed a full interior assessment and restoration quote: flooring, paint, some drywall work in the upstairs hallway, where old water stain had never quite been addressed. All true, incidentally. I'd been meaning to fix that stain for 2 years. Patricia said she could send a 3-person crew out Saturday morning first thing, and that the work would likely take 2 weeks given the scope. 2 weeks. I felt something in my chest unclench slightly at the words. The second call went to a heating and cooling company for an emergency inspection of the central air system, which actually had been making an odd rattling noise for about a month. I wasn't lying about that either. I was simply choosing, for the first time in my marriage, to prioritize my own house's actual needs over my own exhaustion, in service of everyone else's comfort. The third call was to a painting company Diane had recommended, one she said was reliable about honoring contract terms, including the standard clause about occupancy during active work, no residents on the premises during interior painting, and floor refinishing for safety and liability reasons. That clause was the whole point. I had it read back to me twice. By Saturday morning, all 3 crews were scheduled to arrive between 8 and 9. I'd already contacted my insurance company, who confirmed that under my recovery plan, I qualified for a short-term stay at a rehabilitation apartment complex about 15 minutes from the house, a place with grab bars in the bathroom, a single-level layout, and a nurse who did wellness checks twice a week. I hadn't mentioned this option to Kyle because he hadn't asked. Not once in 5 days had he asked where I planned to actually recover while hosting 12 people. I packed a bag Friday night while Kyle was at his brother's house, presumably finalizing arrival logistics. I moved slowly, the brace creaking faintly with each motion, folding just enough clothes for 2 weeks. My medications, the folder with my post-surgical instructions, my laptop, the framed photo of my parents that had sat on our dresser for years. I left a note on the kitchen counter, not dramatic, just factual. Gone to recovery housing per doctor's orders. House is closed for scheduled renovation work beginning Saturday. Contractors have keys. Please don't interfere with their schedule. It's a liability issue with the insurance. I drove myself to the rehab apartment Friday night, wincing every time I hit a pothole, and slept better than I had in 5 days. Saturday morning I wasn't there to see it, but Kyle told me about it later in pieces in the weeks that followed, and I've stitched the account together from what he and eventually Linda admitted. 3 SUVs pulled into our driveway around 10 live that morning, packed with suitcases, coolers, folding beach chairs, a cooler specifically for the seafood Ethan's wife insisted on bringing every year. 12 people spilled out onto the lawn, chattering, already discussing who'd sleep where. And there, taped to the front door at eye level, were 2 printed signs laminated so they wouldn't curl in the humidity. Home closed for renovation. No occupancy until further notice. Per contractor and insurance requirements. Behind the signs, through the front windows, they could see the crew already inside. A man in coveralls sanding down the hallway floor, plastic sheeting draped over the living room furniture, the unmistakable chemical smell of primer already seeping out through the screen door. Bull Kyle later admitted he'd tried uselessly to pry open. Kyle stood on the porch, according to Linda, for what she described as a very long time, just staring at the sign like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. Patricia's crew foreman came to the door, polite but firm, and explained that the property was under an active service contract prohibiting occupancy during the work standard liability protocol. Reedy. Nothing personal, sir, just company policy and the terms of the agreement. Kyle called me 4 times before I even turned my phone back on. When I finally did, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed in my rehab apartment, I watched the missed call notifications stack up on the screen one after another, like something building toward a wave. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt mostly a strange and unfamiliar calm, the particular quiet of a woman who has, for the first time in 2 decades, made a decision entirely for herself and is bracing gently for what comes next. I let the fourth call from Kyle go to voicemail before I finally picked up on the fifth. Money. His voice came through sharp and clipped, none of the smoothness he usually carried like a second skin. What did you do? No greeting. No, how are you feeling? Just that. Like an accusation dropped on the table between us. I kept my voice level the way I'd practiced in my head more than once over the past few days. Exactly what my surgeon asked me to do, Kyle. I'm recovering from major surgery. I can't host 12 people right now. I told you that. You said no one was waiting. Melissa, my parents are standing on the porch. Ethan's kids are asking why we can't go inside. Do you understand what you've done? I understand I hired a licensed contractor to do work my house has needed for 2 years, I said. I understand my insurance is covering my recovery housing. I understand I told you 5 days ago that I needed you to postpone this trip, and you told me no one was waiting. There was a silence on the line that felt longer than it probably was. Then he hung up. Linda called next, and I almost didn't answer, but some old habit of politeness, or maybe just curiosity about what she'd say, made me pick up. Her voice was tight with the particular fury of a woman used to getting her way through sheer persistence. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? We drove 6 hours. The children are exhausted. This is completely selfish of you, Melissa. Completely it's. She caught herself before finishing the word, but I heard it anyway, heard the shape of it in her throat, each key, selfish. As though a woman 5 days out from spinal surgery, asking not to host a house full of relatives was the height of selfishness. And not the years she'd spent accepting my labor, as though it were simply weather, simply something that happened rather than something I did. I didn't argue with her. I'd learned over 2 decades that arguing with Linda was like trying to hold water in your hands. The more you gripped, the faster it slipped through. Instead, I texted her a photo of my discharge paperwork, the surgeon's restrictions printed in bold at the bottom. No lifting over 10 pounds, no standing longer than 15 minutes, minimum 4 weeks recovery. Then I texted simply, "This is why. I hope you all find comfortable arrangements." And I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and didn't look at it again that day. George's voicemail came through later that evening, his tone booming even through the phone's tinny speaker. Something about how I'd made the whole family look foolish, how a wife doesn't just disappear when her husband needs her. I listened to it once, then deleted it, and found that my hands weren't even shaking. I'd expected to feel shaken. Instead, I felt like someone who'd finally set down a piece of furniture she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten. Her arms could ache from something other than that specific weight. The Kyle, meanwhile, was navigating a crisis I'd spent 22 summers quietly managing, without him ever noticing the machinery behind it. 12 people needed somewhere to sleep, and nothing was available at the reasonable inn on Route 9. Apparently, there was a wedding that weekend, so he ended up booking rooms at the Marriott, near the interstate 2 hours. Before check-in even opened at a rate that I later learned, from the one time he made the mistake of complaining about it, within earshot of Ethan, came to just under $4,000 for the full 2 weeks, not counting meals. I heard through the fragments Kyle let slip in the days that followed, how the week unfolded for him. He was the one who had to figure out at 9:00 at night what a family of 12 wanted for dinner, only to discover that George didn't like the Italian place Kyle had picked. And Linda's stomach couldn't handle the Mexican restaurant Ethan suggested as a compromise. And the toddler needed a specific brand of crackers that wasn't sold at the gas station's convenience store, where Kyle ended up exhausted at 10:00 p.m. He was the one driving his parents to the pharmacy for George's blood pressure medication, which they'd forgotten, and driving Ethan's teenagers to the outlet mall because they were bored and fielding a dozen small requests that used to simply resolve themselves before he even noticed them as requests, because I had always resolved them first. I wasn't there to see any of it, but I could picture it with unsettling clarity, because I'd lived it myself for 22 summers invisible and unthanked. There was something almost meditative about not being the one solving it this time. I spent my days at the rehab apartment doing the exercises my physical therapist had given me. Short, careful walks down the hallway, ice on my back in the evenings. reading a novel I'd started 8 months ago and never finished because there was never quiet enough in my own house to hold a thought for longer than 10 minutes. On the third night, I lay on the narrow bed listening to the hum of the air conditioner, and I let myself feel for the first time without guilt trailing behind it like something close to peace. I wasn't punishing anyone. I kept telling myself that, and mostly I believed it. I was simply finally not disappearing. By the fifth day, something in Kyle's text started to shift. The first 2 days had been all accusation, capital letters, exclamation points, a barely restrained fury I recognized from the rare arguments we'd had over the years, always about money or his mother, never about me. But by Wednesday the tone changed. Long day? He texted, no punctuation, no complaint attached to it. Just those two flat words sent at 11 at night. Thursday. Mom wants steak for dinner, but Dad says no red meat since his cholesterol appointment. Can't win. I didn't respond to either. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I simply didn't have an answer for him yet, and I'd stopped believing it was my job to always have one. By the end of that first week, I heard from Chloe, who'd apparently gotten an earful from her grandmother about the whole situation, and called me sounding more amused than alarmed. "Mom," she said, laughing into the phone. "Grandma Linda called me asking if I could talk some sense into you. I told her you just had spine surgery, and she should probably talk some sense into herself." I laughed, too. The first real laugh I'd had in nearly a week, and something in my chest loosened at the sound of my daughter defending me without my even asking. Kyle called on the 6th day, and this time his voice sounded different, worn down at the edges, none of the sharpness from that first call. "The kids are cranky. Mom's complaining the hotel pillows are too firm. Dad wants to know why we can't just go stay at Ethan's place instead, and Ethan says his house isn't big enough. Which, Melissa, it's not big enough for 4 people, let alone 12. But somehow our house was always supposed to be." He stopped himself like he'd surprised himself by saying it out loud. "I've been doing the grocery runs every morning. Linda has an opinion about literally every single item." I didn't realize how much he didn't finish the sentence, and I didn't finish it for him. That was the moment I opened the spreadsheet I'd kept for 15 years. I want to explain what that spreadsheet was because it wasn't born out of bitterness, not originally. I'd started it back when Chloe was in elementary school, mostly to track our household budget, grocery costs, utility bills, the ordinary bookkeeping of a family trying to save for a daughter's college fund. But somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, I'd started logging the summer visits too. Bolt not out of any grand plan, just the same instinct that made me keep receipts for everything else. Groceries during the 2-week visits always noticeably higher than our normal weeks. The spike in the water and electric bills every July. The cost of the air mattresses we'd replaced twice because the teenagers punctured them. The new mattress in the guest room after George's back trouble required something firmer. B. The rental car we'd covered 1 year, when Ethan's transmission gave out mid-visit, and he just needed a little help getting back on his feet. The airfare we'd quietly paid for Linda and George, 3 separate times when their retirement account, as George put it, was a little tight that year. I sat at the small kitchen table in my rehab apartment and added it all up slowly, carefully, the way you'd count something you'd been avoiding counting for a long time. The number that appeared at the bottom of the column made me sit back in my chair. $185,412 over 22 years. Groceries, utilities, repairs, mattresses, the rental car, the airfare, the endless small accommodations that had never once reciprocated, never once even been acknowledged as a cost rather than an obligation. I didn't cry though, I thought I might. Instead, I felt something colder and clearer settle over me. The same sensation I imagine a surgeon must feel studying an X-ray before an operation. Not anger exactly, but a kind of precise unemotional clarity about the shape of the problem in front of her. I thought about Kyle's voice on the phone that afternoon, worn thin, after less than a week of doing what I'd done for 2 decades without complaint. I thought about how quickly the family story about me, selfish, ungrateful, difficult, had assembled itself the moment I stopped absorbing the cost of their comfort. Nobody had asked what it cost me. Nobody had asked not once in 22 years whether I was tired, whether I was well, whether I wanted a summer that didn't revolve around service. Middle. I closed the laptop, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I began to think not about defending myself, but about being seen. Not through anger, through evidence. There's a particular kind of quiet a person carries when they've decided finally to stop explaining themselves and simply show the math instead. I spent the final days of my 2 weeks preparing something I'd never made before in my life, a presentation about my own marriage. It felt strange sitting at that small kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of printer paper bought at the drugstore down the street, formatting years of receipts and bank statements into something that could be read at a glance the way you'd prepare a report for a boardroom rather than a family. But that's essentially what it had become. 22 years of unpaid, unacknowledged labor laid out in black and white. I titled the cover page simply 22 Years of Hospitality. Underneath in smaller text, the total $185,412. Then page by page the breakdown 2004 through this year. Groceries during summer visits, itemized against our normal monthly averages. The spike in utilities every July circled in red. The replacement air mattresses, the guest room mattress, the rental car, the 3 years of airfare for George and Linda. I included photographs too, ones I'd taken over the years without any particular purpose beyond documentation. Linda in the kitchen, I'd stalked George asleep in the recliner. I'd bought specifically, because his back needed the support. The receipts themselves scanned and dated undeniable. I called Kyle on what would have been the last day of the visit and asked him to gather everyone at the house that evening. The renovation crew had finished 2 days early, the floors gleaming, the hallway wall finally free of its water stain, the air conditioning running quiet and even for the first time in months. He agreed, sounding cautious, maybe even relieved that I was finally engaging again after 2 weeks of near silence. I arrived that evening, still moving carefully, the brace loosened slightly now that I was 6 days further into recovery, and found all 12 of them gathered in the living room, perched on furniture that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. I could see it on their faces, the moment I walked in, the assumption worn openly that I'd come to apologize, to explain myself, maybe to cry a little, and let them comfort me back into my old role. Linda even stood up, arms half raised as though preparing for the kind of embrace that precedes forgiveness. I didn't sit down. I distributed the folders instead, one to each person, moving slowly around the room, saying nothing until everyone had one in their lap. Then I stood by the fireplace, the same spot where I'd stood in 100 Christmas photos over the years, always slightly out of frame, and I let them read the cover page in silence. Linda's face changed first, then George's. Ethan flipped through the pages faster than the others, his jaw tightening with each one, landing on the photograph of the rental car receipt from the year his transmission failed. "Can anyone name one vacation?" I said, my voice steady, quieter than I expected it to come out, where I was treated like a guest instead of the maid. Nobody answered. The room had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that has weight to it. "Can anyone remember?" I continued, asking whether I was healthy enough or rested enough, or simply willing before inviting yourselves into my home for 2 weeks at a time every single summer for 22 years. Still nothing. Kyle sat on the arm of the sofa staring down at his own folder, and I watched something happen in his face that I hadn't seen in a long time. Not defensiveness, not the reflexive loyalty to his family that I'd grown so used to, something closer to recognition. "I'm not asking for the money back," I said, and I meant it. "I'm not interested in being repaid. I kept this because somewhere along the way I stopped being able to trust my own sense of what was fair. I needed to see it written down to believe it myself." I looked at Linda specifically because I think some part of me needed her of all of them to understand. I have loved having this family in my life. I have never once loved being invisible in my own house. George cleared his throat like he might say something, but nothing came out. Ethan closed his folder and set it on the coffee table, his ears red. Linda sat back down slowly, the folder still open on her lap to the photograph of herself in my kitchen, and for the first time since I'd known her, She looked less like a woman, preparing an argument, than more like a woman confronting an accounting she hadn't expected to face. I didn't wait for an apology that evening. I didn't think one was not yet, and I'd stopped needing it to arrive on any particular schedule. I simply gathered my things, told Kyle I'd see him at home once the paint smell cleared from the guest room, and drove myself back to the rehab apartment for one more night. The folder of my own labor sitting finally in someone else's hands instead of mine. I moved back into the house 11 days after I'd left it, walking through rooms that smelled faintly of fresh paint instead of the usual chaos of a family visit winding down. The hallway floor gleamed under new varnish. The air conditioning hummed evenly, no more rattling. It felt oddly like moving into a version of my own home that had been waiting for me all along, just underneath the version I'd been living in for 22 years. Kyle and I didn't have some big dramatic conversation that first night. That's not how real repair works. I've come to understand, not in one sweeping speech, but in 100 small adjustments made quietly over time. What we did have a few days later, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, was a conversation I'd been waiting half my marriage to have. I didn't know it added up to that much, he said, turning his mug slowly in his hands. Not just the money, all of it. The driving, the meals, the I didn't know because I never had to know. You always just handled it. I know, I said, and I wasn't trying to make him feel worse. I was just telling the truth the way I'd promised myself I would from now on, even when it was uncomfortable. I'm not going to pretend those 2 weeks weren't awful, he admitted, a small tired laugh escaping him. My mother complained about hotel pillows for 4 straight days. I don't think I slept more than 5 hours a night the entire time. He looked up at me, then something more honest in his face than I'd seen from him in years. But I understand now. I actually understand, Melissa. I don't think I ever really did before. We agreed that week on something we should have agreed on years earlier. No more open door policy. No more assuming the house belonged to whoever wanted it whenever they wanted it. Any future visit from his family, or mine for that matter, though my side had always been smaller, quieter, easier, would require both of our agreement in advance, and would come with clear expectations. Guests would help with groceries, and guests would clean up after themselves. Guests would not treat me as staff, simply because I happened to know where everything was kept. The real test came about 6 weeks later at a smaller family dinner. Just Kyle's parents, this time invited properly, with 2 weeks' notice, and an explicit conversation beforehand about what the visit would look like. Izzy George arrived stiff and formal, clearly still smarting from the folder I'd handed him, and made a point of complimenting the renovated hallway in a tone that suggested he was trying very hard to find something safe to say. Linda, for her part, brought a casserole dish, something she had never once done in 22 years of visits, and set it on the counter with a kind of careful deliberateness, as though placing an offering. Partway through dinner, Ethan called Kyle's phone. He hadn't been invited this time, something Kyle and I had discussed and agreed on together, and I heard Kyle's voice shift into something firmer than I was used to hearing him use with his brother. No, Ethan, not this time. We're keeping it small. You're welcome to visit, but you'll need to plan it with us in advance, same as anyone else. I looked up from the stove surprised, and found Kyle watching me checking. I think whether he'd said the right thing. I nodded just slightly, and he nodded back. Later that evening, after his parents left, George paused at the door and said gruffly, not quite looking at me, "House looks good." The floor. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one. But it was George Roberts acknowledging something out loud that he'd have once considered beneath him to notice, and I decided to let that be enough for now. It was Kyle, though, who surprised me most. A few nights later, we were in the kitchen and I overheard him on the phone with his father, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Dad, I need you to understand something. This is Melissa's home, too, if we're being precise about it. It was her home before it was ever mine. I should have remembered that years ago, and I didn't, and that's on me, not her." There was a pause, George's voice rumbling indistinctly on the other end, and then Kyle said simply, "I'm not arguing about it anymore." That's just how it's going to be. I stood in the doorway with a dish towel in my hands, listening to my husband defend me to his father for what might have been the first time in our entire marriage, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for longer than I'd realized. Months passed, autumn came, and with it, the ordinary rhythms of our life. Chloe home for a long weekend, the leaves turning along our street, my back finally fully healed, the brace long since packed away in the closet. Then one Tuesday evening in October, my phone rang, and it was Linda. I almost didn't answer out of old habit more than anything, but I did, and her voice when it came was different than I expected, smaller, almost tentative, nothing like the commanding tone I'd known for 2 decades. "Melissa," she said, "I was wondering, would next Saturday be a good time to visit? Just for the afternoon? I'd call ahead, of course, and bring something for lunch, if that's all right with you." I smiled, standing alone in my kitchen, the late afternoon light coming gold through the window over the sink. It wasn't an apology. Linda Roberts, I suspected, would never quite manage the words themselves, but it was something I'd waited 22 years to hear. A woman who had once treated my home as a birthright, now asking gently, humbly, if she might be allowed to knock. "Saturday would be lovely, Linda," I said. "I'll see you then. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've ever given so much of yourself that people forgot to ask whether you had anything left to give." I hope this story reminded you that it's never too late to be seen. I'd love to know where this story found you tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know what city you're watching from. I read every single one. We have new stories like this waiting for you every day. So, subscribe now so you never miss a moment like this one. Let's keep this journey going together.